Good afternoon, and welcome to Session 5, Programmer's Paradise webinar for customizing SQL generation for maximum ROI. For today's webinar, we were going to go over a little bit of who we are first, and then we're going to go into customizing SQL generation for maximum ROI, given by Victor Rodriguez. He here is our database and process modeling consultant for Programmer's Paradise. After Victor goes over his slides and goes through a little bit of a demo, we're going to get into some questions and answers. Just a little bit about who we are. We are a leading e-seller of developer and infrastructure tools. We can be found on the web at www.programmers.com, and there you could view our database worldview ecosystem. We are an elite CA partner with the #1 data modeling reseller for CA. We have dedicated CA sales and engineering team here on the floor. DB modeling and infrastructure design and training services offered by Victor, and we are a leader in delivery of CA education. We're an authorized VET VSA partner. Here's a quick overview of our world software ecosystem. We have industry-leading tools for your end-to-end database needs, such as database platforming, design, modeling, development and test, deployment and migration, reporting, and mining. This is our 5th session in this series. The rest of the sessions can be accessed at www.programmers.com/CA on demand. They were all recorded and can be listened to later on. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Victor for customizing SQL generation for maximum ROI. And just an FYI, at the end of the webinar, we are going to be having a live raffle for one person going to win a $10 Best Buy gift card, $100 Best Buy gift card, and every attendee will be getting a $15 gift card for iTunes. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Victor. Victor?
Thanks, Danielle. Hi, everybody. Today's session is customizing SQL generation for maximum ROI, and will be an introduction to the topic and as well as some samples. And as Danielle mentioned, we'll be giving a raffle for a Best Buy gift card at the end, just in time for Christmas. So hopefully everyone will stay around to the end, and we'll see who the winner may be. So the goal of this whole series has been to how do we begin to use what we have to maximize our return on investment and automate the modeling process as much as possible. We can leverage another component of the ERwin software that we can leverage is this forward engineer template editor and the files that they generate. This allows us to customize and reuse custom generated SQL for different reasons that we may be often having to constantly modify the code that ERwin is generating when we send it to our DBA staff, or we just we want to extend even beyond the scope of what ERwin currently supports other features as well. So the agenda we'll be covering today is we'll be looking at what are the forward engineer template files themselves, what is this concept, what is the editor, how do we access them, etc. When should you consider using these? What are the available resources for educating yourself on these on the topic itself? We'll be looking at the forward engineer template editor quickly. We'll be looking at the syntax as well, and then we'll actually look at editing the templates, including a few demos. So with the ERwin Forward Engineer Template Editor, Forward Engineer Template Editor are used to generate all the SQL within ERwin software. So at any time when you're generating alter syntax, or you're using the complete compare, or you're using a forward engineering, for all these circumstances, you can use a forward engineer template file, and this is a TLX macro language, which has a full development environment that's included with the ERwin software. It's fully programmatic language. It allows access to all of the model metadata, so it's not limited to the old ERwin macros as we used to use in the past. This gives you access to all of the metadata within the ERwin the model itself. And basically, this customized SQL is available anywhere where SQL is actually generated within the tool itself. So when do you want to explore the option of using the FET editor, customizing your forward engineer template? There's a few circumstances. One is when you are repeatedly customizing your code. There may often be the case where you may encounter certain syntax that you always want to generate. You're going in, you're manually making this change all the time. This could be something as simple as you want to use add or replace in some circumstances, or create or replace, I should say, syntax in some circumstances, or it could be something more complex where, for example, you want to have certain default table spaces defined on all your tables or something like that. Another circumstance where you may want to customize your forward engineer templates and generate the code is when there's unsupported object syntax. So, for example, in the upcoming ERwin release, you'll have the ability to have calculated column values on Oracle, since this has been added in Oracle 11. This is not currently supported within the editors of ERwin, but you could potentially populate a UDP with that calculated value and use the forward engineer template file to access the UDP information and put it into your SQL syntax. A third option is incorrect syntax. I had a personal experience where Teradata not null, I believe, was incorrectly forgot to put a space basically in the not null syntax, which of course caused parsing error, forward engineer errors. This was corrected by the ERwin team eventually. But rather than waiting for a fix to come through, you could easily correct that syntax error in the forward engineer template file, make that your template, make that the standard across the company, and while you await the official service pack release, you can have a fix on hand that can be easily distributed and avoid problems in the future. Another circumstance is, like I mentioned before, SQL based on variables. So you may have a situation where you may want to have a alternate owner specified on certain tables. Once again, you could create a UDP and basically put an if statement in your FET editor to say that if this value is populated, then use the alternate owner rather than the default owner on that object. And lastly, another often used usage of the forward engineer template is simply to filter out objects. If you use SQL Server, you've probably encountered the situation where you reverse engineer a database and you are seeing collate syntax on all your columns if they're defined at the server level. You may not want to see that in your table definitions. You can easily just cut out the collate statement right out of the forward engineer template file itself, make that your standard, and now you no longer have to manually edit it. Or what we'll see in one of the exercises here is the ability of actually creating a yes or no option based on a UDP, and then putting the expansion within an if-else condition. Another example of where you may want to filter out objects is you may be reverse engineering an Oracle environment and now you're going to push it into a new server. During the reverse engineer process in that model, you included all of your physical storage parameters because that was valid for that model. Of course, you did want to capture that information. You may want to continue to use a table space information, but you may not care about all the table space specifications for the actual storage parameters. So you can filter out that. So you can include the table space name, but filter out the other physical storage parameters from the forward engineer generated SQL itself. So what are some of the available resources? First of all, if you go into the doc folder, right in the installation folder, and if you did attend my previous API webinar, and it's available on demand if you did not, a lot of this is redundant, but your resources are very much the same. There's actually a very useful and full from end-to-end definition of the metadata and the forward engineer template file within the doc folder of the ERwin install folder. There's also a video within the videos folder of the ERwin install directory that actually has an exercise showing how to edit and customize or navigate the forward engineer template editor. ERwin.com. If you're not using ERwin.com, please do go to ERwin.com. You don't even need to register to just navigate. There's a lot of documents there. You do need to register to use the forums. User forums are a very useful resource. Usually if you post something there, it'll be answered very shortly. I'm very active on there. I'll usually answer a handful of questions every week. And if anything that's along the lines of these type of questions, I'm always there to answer your questions. You can contact me, of course, but the ERwin.com is a great resource for anything related to data modeling and access to videos on demand, webinars, etc. And the support.ca.com, if you have registered previously, do navigate and search through the knowledge base. There's a lot of useful information there as well. They also have a video series. There's an old video there that I wrote that I actually presented a few years ago on using the Forward Engineer template file as well. And so that's another really useful resource. ERwin Spy. Similarly to in my last webinar, I mentioned the fact that what's really nice about the Forward Engineer template file and the ODBC editor, which is now available within the software, and the API as well, is that what's nice is that once you kind of become familiar with the metadata standards in the tool, they're reusable for all of these different extendable purposes. And the ERwin Spy is probably, for me, absolutely the best resource for navigating the ERwin metadata and getting a really good understanding of how the relationship between the hierarchies of the objects. And you'll see, even in this simple example here on the screenshot, how this is important to what we're going to be looking at later in the editors themselves. So if you want to understand how to navigate from the stack of objects in the Forward Engineer template editor, and it is a stack of objects, we'll discuss that just very briefly in just a moment. But to understand the relationship from one level to the other, how the objects nest one within the other, and especially the specific properties that exist within each one of those objects, the ERwin Spy is absolutely the best, most useful tool there is for any of these purposes. So let's take a look very quickly at the actual syntax that we're going to be exploring of the Forward Engineer template editor itself. The syntax is TLX syntax. It's fully programmatic, and it has the ability of having a complex logic. But the basic syntax that we're going to be seeing at any time when you're navigating through it or just reading it, and when we look at some of the samples later on, is, of course, at the root level, literals. Anything within quotes are simply literals. They will expand. So text literals will simply expand as text literals. Another type of literal is a property name. So if you see anything that has like property and then in brackets physical underscore name, that would return the physical name of the specific object that context we're in. If we're within the context of a specific entity, physical name will be the physical name of that entity. If we're within an attribute, it'll be that attribute. If we're within a key group, it'll be the index name, for example. There are special characters. This is pretty standard for most programmatic languages. Carriage return is /n, a tab is a /t, a backslash is a double slash, and a double quote is a /quote. The next component of the language that you'll notice is iterative macros. What happens is in this case is that, and this is similar in many cases if you were familiar with the macro language back, the old ERwin macro, the % for each entity, % for each attribute. What happens here, it's a more generic. We have the concept of for each only, and for this example we have here, for each only attribute, and then the property would be physical name, and where we would actually see this expansion would be within an entity. So what you're saying is that you're inside of an entity, that's your current position within the metadata, and what you're looking at is for each only attribute and then the physical name, so this is a property on that particular object. So rather than saying for each entity specifically, we're just saying for each owned object of type attribute within the context of entity. And you can do that for any kind of object. So making this kind of general syntax is more useful for navigating within the nested objects of any level within the model, the metadata itself. Next is, of course, what any kind of programmatic language is actually using any kind of logical argument. So there are multiple types of logical arguments you'll see in the code. One are using keywords. So the ampersand if not, ampersand if else, and or else if I should say, and ampersand else. These are pretty straightforward, as you'd expect. Whenever you see the ampersand, then you know that or actually that's the @ sign. What you actually expect there, that is a keyword within the code, and it never exists in any other context. So if you see the @ if, that's just the beginning of an if statement. If not, of course, is an if not statement. And then you have else or else if. Next, you have conditional blocks. So this is actually right out of the actual syntax that's used to create the create table syntax within the forward engineer. The open close brackets are conditional blocks. So basically, the logic is that if what's inside that conditional block expands, then present the information. If it does not expand, then ignore it. So in this particular case, it says create table. It's the property we're looking for is DB owner, and there's an actual period within that syntax as well, and then the close bracket. So what that means is that if there's a DB owner, we're going to see the syntax expanding for DB owner and a period following the syntax as well. If that syntax, if the DB owner is not defined on the object, then the entire bracket is ignored. So we just get a create table and then the name of the table. And the last conditional block we'll see is the propagated block. So this is a combination of the conditional blocks we saw above, and now we have those less than greater than signs that are kind of encompassing the block itself. So what is happening in this particular case is my name is, and then we see the property name and property last name. So what actually happens is that if both of those conditions actually expand, then the entire thing is generated. But if it fails, then the entire thing is skipped. So everything within the conditional blocks within the propagated blocks are ignored. And that's the basic logic that we'll see within the code itself. The objects themselves work off of a stack. So it's all based on this stack. Use ERwin Spy, like I mentioned before, to identify the relationship between the objects to see how many steps up or down the stack you need to navigate. And then you navigate the context of the stack in two ways. One is to use push owner or pop. If you've ever used any kind of stacking language before, you've probably used push and pop. The syntax is a little bit different. It's a push owner and pop. So when you push owner, you move up one level in the stack. When you pop that object off the top, you move back to your original context. And the second concept is that context navigation is using for each only. Like I mentioned before, if you're within a context of like table, or in this case actually entity would be the proper terminology in ERwin, you can have a for each only attribute, and that will be you're going to collect all the attributes within that object. Or you could also have like for each only key group, and that would collect all the indexes within that table. So you have the syntax and then the specification as to what objects you'd like to navigate through. Quickly, I'll just introduce some other syntax, and you can look into this in much more detail. The PDF document has full definitions of all of these types of objects, but we won't need to see this where I'm kind of giving you a very high-level overview and maybe a lot of information on how the syntax works. But in the samples we're actually going to see, these are going to be very straightforward, pretty simple to implement. So some other syntax to introduce here. There's more stack options. You can use property through, property from, and basically that means that you can actually get a property through another object. So if there's an owned object, you can actually get a property through another object. So if you're in an entity, for example, you can get a property through an index. So wherever you are in your context, you can move to, these are other options of navigating to other areas of the metadata. There's also specific flags defined on a property. So for each property is inherited, for example, will give you a 1 or 0 value depending on this true or false based on whether there is inheritance on that object or not. And lastly, we'll also see in just a moment when we introduce the editor itself, that you're going to see these double colon syntax. The double colon syntax is for macro language that expands only within specific context in the editor itself. So for example, your forward engineer macros have this FE : syntax. And they're limited to expanding in specific areas of the code. So the forward engineer editor, there are two places you can launch this from. One is from the tools menu. One is from the forward engineer editor itself. And I'll show you both of those when we go into the demo. When you're actually in the editor, what you'll see is, just to show you very briefly the actual tool menu options there. In the upper right window, you have the ability of specifying the templates So for example, create entity is highlighted there, so that's the actual bit of code we'll be looking at in this particular screen capture. We have a sample context, so you always specify a particular object you want to see the expansion from. Make sure that the context and the object type match. So create entity, you want to specify an entity. In this case, table 1 is what was being specified as our sample context. If you're looking at your create attribute syntax, then make sure you're looking at a specific column. The table level syntax is going to expand incorrectly or maybe not at all if your current context is a table and you've specified create attribute. All available macros in the language are in the lower left. In the lower left. So you can actually navigate to any one of those. You can right-click and see a pop-up window that gives you a definition of the macro and example of where it can be used and the expanded form of the code. The expanded text pane, the one in the lower right, is an actual expansion of the actual code up top. So we see there, like the create table statement, this is being generated on the fly live by the expansion of the template source pane above. And we'll see that if you just make a minor modification in there, it will actually immediately impact the pane below. The editors up top is pretty straightforward. You have the ability of, there's a help menu, you can delete, you can create new macros, you can save your template file, you can open the template file. Pretty straightforward. Oh, and there's also a find tool. The find tool is actually very useful, and we'll show that in just a moment in our actual samples. So here in this pane here, I just quickly wanted to show you that the pane down below is immediately responding to the code above. You'll notice that this was not to serve any really good purpose here, but I've added the create temp. I've just typed in temp as a literal within the open close parentheses, and we'll see immediately down below in my screen, it now says create temp table, TBL1. So immediately if you make the changes up top, they expand down below. Don't be afraid to play around with this editor. You can't harm the tool in any way. If it doesn't expand correctly, it blows up on you, gives you a whole bunch of GDM errors, and it's not expanding correctly. There's no harm, no foul. You simply don't use that template file. You just throw it away afterwards. And ERwin, by default, will always be pointing at canned generic FET files that come pre-installed with the software. Those files can always be reverted to. Even if you've overwritten them, you can always revert to them again. So there's no, feel free to experiment and have fun and learn the language. Trial and error is the best way to learn anything, for me anyway. So now we'll actually be looking at example. So like I mentioned before, feel free to experiment. You can always revert to the saved FETs. Before you start doing anything with the coding, it's very important to understand, just like anything you do programmatically, it's very important to understand what your desired result is. So what is the result I want to get to? What is the easiest way to do that? Is the code already doing 90% of what I want? If it is, then how can I use what is already the logic that's already built into the templates to make my modification? Use the find tool within the editor itself. Very quickly locate the syntax itself. If you're trying to drill into all this code, sometimes hundreds of lines of code, trying to find a particular piece of the SQL that's going to be generated, the easiest thing to do is simply find it. Use, find the word collate or something like that, whatever the syntax you're looking for, and jump right to that piece of code, and then just kind of look around it and see what's generating this particular syntax. Don't rewrite everything. Most things require just simple conditional changes, and that's kind of like the takeaway from, hopefully, from most of these examples. So the examples we're going to be looking at, one of them is going to be adding if exists syntax to your foreign key constraints. Another one is going to be adding Netezza syntax since ERwin does not have native Netezza syntax, but let's say you wanted to build a custom FET file that generated your Netezza syntax. So I'll show you a starting point there that might be useful. And lastly, we're going to be looking, or actually first, we'll probably be looking at the filter collate on SQL Server columns. I might actually jump to that one first. So let me actually share my desktop. And if we do a reverse engineer, and I just use my blank template here for my SQL Server, 2005. and I just reverse engineered the pubs sample database. When I forward engineer, if I preview my syntax, I get all this collate syntax on my strings. Now, this is actually a server property, so this is not incorrect syntax. However, it is more than I necessarily want to see, and there's no convenient way right now to remove these. And I don't necessarily want to delete them out of the entire model. It could be painstaking, but I don't want to see it in my SQL syntax. So let's say that I wanted to edit my SQL Server 2005 FET file, and here, introducing the editor here quickly. Here's the current FET. This is the standard FET that's being used, but I want to edit it. So I just click this edit button right here. This is simply telling me that the that changes that made to the FET file will impact my SQL, which is exactly what I want. And let's take a look at the syntax for a particular table. So I'll see here, the sample context is this discounts table. I'm going to select create entity. By default, this is already selected, but it is the context that I actually want to be in. And this is the actual body of the syntax. So this is the code that is generating that create table syntax. It's pretty daunting to look at it all at once. But what I'm concerned with is the collate syntax. So if I do a find, and I'll do a find on collate, I'll see that this is where the property for the collate is actually being generated. So I could simply delete this out of the code. And now if I go back to my table definition down here, let me just scroll up, I no longer am seeing those collate statements. So simple as that, I've made the modification to my code. So now I no longer see the collate statements. I can do a save template file. I'll save this as, let me just save this on my desktop as no collate. If I spelled that correctly. And now if I preview my SQL again, here's my collate statements. I'm going to click this browse button. I'm going to select the no collate statements. I'm going to do a preview again. And here we go, no collate statements. So simple as that, I've made the modification. These are constraints, by the way. I can remove them if I don't want to see them by just turning that off. But if I, so simple as that, I've already made the customization. So if my DBA doesn't want to see those collate statements, I've quickly just did a search in the editor itself, located the code that's generating the collate, deleted it from the code, and now it's gone. And now I no longer need to see it when I forward engineer my SQL. However, another option for doing this, and maybe a little more elegantly, is to use a template file. So I'm actually going to use a reverse engineer, and I'm going to use a template that I built earlier today. If I remember where it is, collate UDP template. There we go. And the same model as before. This is the pubs connection I'm going to use. I'm going to reverse engineer. There's some color specifications in this template file, but for the most part, this is the same model. And what I've actually built here is I have in my model properties, I have a UDP called col collation that I put in here. And by default, it's reading yes. And when I forward engineer and I preview, I do see those collate statements just like we saw before. However, I can change this UDP value to no. And now if I do a forward engineer preview, I do not see any collate statements. So now the way this is happening is that rather than just cutting out the collate statement, I've actually put a condition in here. So this is, and it's 3 lines of code that I've basically written into the code. So once again, we're in the create entity syntax. We're in the same table, discounts. And what I've actually created is the this is the first bit of syntax I've written here. So let me explain exactly what this reads. The beginning is push owner. Now the reason I'm doing a push owner is because remember, we're moving in a stack. So we're in the create entity level. We're within an actual entity of the model. So we want to move to where the UDP is. We defined the UDP at the model level. I defined it at the model level. The model level is, if I go to my ERwin SPY, the model level is 1 level up from the table level. So if I'm at any entity level, I want to move one level up in my stack. And I do that by using the push owner option. So I push from my entity level up to my model level, and then I create an if condition. I say if model property col collation, which is the UDP that I defined, is set to the value of yes, then I'm going to set the global flag to collate flag. Now, all this means is set global flag is simply the ability to create a flag. You can call it anything you'd like. I selectively called it collate flag, but I could have called it anything I'd like to. And then afterwards, I do a pop. Now, the reason I do a pop is because I pushed up to the model level. I'm popping back down to where I was before the entity level. So other than the push and the pop, the only thing I've done here, I create an if condition, and I'm saying if this property is equal to yes, using the equal here, then set the global flag to collate flag. So then let's jump down to collate. Now the only thing I've added here is if is global flag set collate flag. So this is collate flag. This is the one I just set to yes. If the UDP value is set to yes, then this would be defined as, flag would be set to true. So is this global flag set? If yes, then use the collate syntax. But if no, you ignore it. So now what we've done is rather than just cutting the collate statement out, which is completely a viable method. If you never want to see that collate syntax, simply cut it out of the code. But let's say you sometimes want to see it, sometimes you don't want to see it. You can simply create this flag setting using the UDP and then just use an if statement and basically say if it's set, then expand the code. If not, then don't. And of course, the reason that this occurred right when I did the reverse engineer is another topic I've covered in the webinar, but it's because I'm using a template file. So by using a template file, not only did I store the layout settings, these colors that I'm using, these fonts, this red migrating attribute specification, but on top of that, I'm also specifying exactly the FET file that I'm going to be using, and it's the one that specifies this collation UDP option. So I save that as a template file. I can do a reverse engineer, make sure to specify that as my template, and then I have the ability of reusing that whenever I want within the model properties themselves. So the next exercise I wanted to look at is the ability, for example, to support something that doesn't even exist within the ERwin software itself. Excuse me. So, for example, Netezza. Some users use the ODBC connection in ERwin to reverse engineer the Netezza system catalog. But once you've done so, there are certain properties within Netezza that are not supported by just an ODBC forward engineering. One of those properties is the concept of DistributeOn. So what we've done here is we've defined this table here, this PC claim reg table, and we want to have DistributeOn this claim pound table, a column, I should say. So in my column editor, you'll see that I have defined a UDP DistributeOn, and the default values I specified is, since it's a list, I specified blank, comma, yes, or Y. The reason I did that is by default, I want that first value to be my default value. So by default, there will be no DistributeOn value for any of these attributes. But then I want it on this particular column. So on claim, I'm actually going to define my DistributeOn value on that column. Now when I forward engineer and I preview, you'll notice that I have correct syntax for Netezza syntax for my create table statement, and at the end I have this DistributeOn claim pound. You'll notice that on this other table, this E2 table I created briefly, there is no DistributeOn because I didn't define a DistributeOn column there. If I had, and I can do that quickly here, I could just make A my DistributeOn column, and if I forward engineer and preview that, now I see the syntax here as well. So how do we do this? Let's take a quick look, and we'll browse through our editor once again. Oh, I'm sorry, apologize. I wanted to click the edit button, actually. So here's my expansion for the claim table, and we'll see that this DistributeOn syntax on this particular column. So where is this coming from? The first place it's actually coming from, let me actually go to the context of a particular attribute. And that complaint, by the way, that pop-up window is saying that I've selected an attribute, but I'm actually at the entity level. So I'm actually, the reason I did that is because I actually want to move to the attribute level to show you what I've done. Actually, it's in the clause for columns, I believe. Here we go. So, and I do want to introduce this quickly. I didn't really cover this in the presentation, but you can define clauses just by defining a single colon. So you would just say clause colon, and then you can give it any name you'd like to name it. But what this is basically saying is that this is a clause that you can call from within another function. You actually don't have to do that. It's just easier to find them later on when you're navigating around. I did not build this clause, by the way. This is actually standard with the ERwin template file itself. But what I've done here is that I added, once again, an if statement. And in this if statement, I have basically said that this is very similar to what I did at the model level before, but now I'm doing it at the column level. I'm saying that if the property attribute.physicalDistributeOn, this is the UDP that I defined previously. If that UDP is Y, then I'm going to set DistributeColumn property physical name. So this DistributeColumn is simply a variable that I'm going to set to a value, and the value is going to be the physical name of this column. I want to capture the name of this column because that's going to be, I'm going to use that later on in my create entity syntax. And I'll show you that if I just copy this, where it exists at my create entity level. Once again, I'm in the wrong syntax, or I should say the wrong context, so let me move back to a table. And let's do a find for DistributeColumn. So what I've done here is you'll see, so we have the entire expansion of the actual table definition. This is right out of the box. We haven't changed anything at all. All I've done now is I've put a carriage return here at the end. I put a explicit string value, DistributeOn. The value is the string value that I'm returning from the column level. And then end of statement. Now, you'll notice that I put this within the conditional block I mentioned before. The reason for the conditional block, of course, is if it fails to expand, it's ignored. So it's not going to generate an error on my SQL. It's not going to generate characters that can't be read. It's simply going to not expand at all. So that's where the conditional blocks come in. You basically put a condition inside of there, and you're saying that if anything within this condition fails to expand, then ignore it. So you don't get a distribute on blank, you get you don't see anything at all. But if it does expand correctly, if you have defined the DistributeColumn variable, you do pass it back here, then it will expand within the column. And that's where we actually see this DistributeOn, and then the claim pound is the column that we're using for this, to do this on. You can use this for many other situations. You may, for example, want to define default table spaces for your indexes or default table spaces for your tables. And you can put those within a UDP as well and basically say if there's a value there, then create the syntax for, for the storage properties for the table space. And if there's not, then there isn't. Why is that useful? Because you may not want to manually go in, and if it's always going to be the same table space on all your tables, you may not want to manually go in and write this every single time. You could just create a UDP and basically say, if this value is defined, then use that value. If there's no value defined, then use the default. And you could just put that right into the code, and it will expand appropriately. There's another point I wanted to bring up here within this editor as well. But it's not coming to me, but let me go to the next example. The last example I wanted to show is the ability to customize SQL. So we're going to actually create an if exists syntax on your foreign key definitions. So here's a very simple, two-table model that I've built here. But the important point here is not necessarily the complexity of the model, and that's actually what I wanted to bring up in the last example, is that if you've noticed, just like when you do anything programmatically, you definitely want to experiment with small models first, and that's actually what I wanted to bring up. Of course, it means always a best practice. Use a simple model. If you're just concerned with generating the syntax on a foreign key, or if you're just interested in, seeing the behavior on particular foreign key primary key names or something like that, then you can do that with a very small model. So before you go to full production and you start testing with massive models, just simply test it on with a 1 or 2 table expansion. See that it works there correctly. See that the conditions are correct. Test it. Do a little QA. Try it with different types of tables, different physical storage properties, etc. Whatever your code is working around. And then once you have that tested pretty well, roll that out to a larger environment. But definitely don't start with a complex model. So here we have a simple model. The reason it can be very simple in this particular case is we're really only concerned with the syntax on foreign key generation. So if I look at my parent table here, I have this constraint that's being defined here, and by default, we'll have this alter table child add constraint for the foreign key. But what have we added to this syntax is this if not exists. Select from sys.foreign keys where referenced object ID in select ID from sys objects, blah, 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 parent. And if what this syntax itself is saying is that if there does not exist a column or an entry in the sys.foreign key system catalog value for a relationship between parent and child with this constraint name, which is the one that was generated when we built these 2 tables, if not exists, then we generate the table and we generate it, which of course means that if it does exist, we will not be generating the constraint. So another perfect example of where you may want to customize your SQL, you just want to generate your foreign key constraint text for where their constraints are not currently defined. And so how do you add this into your actual, how can you make this a reusable template? So the way we do this is we actually click the edit button once again. And if I go to the parent table, I actually have to go to the child table because that's the one that has the foreign key constraint on it. And then here we have the syntax for it. So let's take a look for, in the code itself, let's look for the if not exists. Oh. If not exists. So what we've done here actually is, let me just show you where we entered it into the syntax itself. Now, first of all, the way I located this position to enter this is simply by, once again, don't have no reason to reinvent the wheel, just see what you already have and just add to it. So initially, I'm looking at the alter table child, add constraint, etc. So I actually just did a search until I found the alter table syntax within the this expansion itself. And then, of course, I wanted to insert this if condition in front of this area. So I jump in here, and the if not exists is always going to be the same syntax. In this case, it's not even conditional. We don't even have to define a UDP to put an if clause in there or anything like that. We're always going to put this if condition in front of our alter table add foreign key constraint. So we say if not exists, select asterisk from system foreign keys. This is always going to be the same. Then we put a carriage return in there. Once again, a literal, we're using quotes, so this is a literal, where referenced object ID in, select ID from system objects where name equals, and now here's where we need the variables in the code itself. So the first one is the parent entity reference. So rather than, once again, rather than reinventing the wheel, you're already within an index object there is a property. If you use ERwin Spy, you open up the index, you navigate to that particular index, and you take a look at it, you'll see there's a property there that says parent entity reference. So if you need to return the parent name as part of your syntax statement, use the ERwin Spy to locate the property. The property already exists within the ERwin metadata, and just make that a variable within the code. Then we do a carriage return, and we do the same thing for child. Add and parent object blah, 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 where the child name here down below is actually going to be property child entity reference. Once again, the metadata contains a parent entity reference, contains a child entity reference, and we can use that to navigate from one to the other. And name equals, and this is quoted name. Now, quoted name is this is a syntax within which is specific to the TLX editor. I could have actually used property physical name, for example, and it would have returned the physical name of the relationship itself. But I just use quoted name. It's like a kind of a shorthand within the tool where it basically says whatever your current object is, it will return the physical name of that object. And if you use quotes, then you will return quotes around it. If not, and this is depending on whether you've specified it in your forward engineer option set. If you specify quotes, it'll have quotes around the name. If not, it will ignore them. But once again, it's just standard, so when you see quoted name, that's what it means. And of course, the rest of this alter table, this entire syntax is just right out of the box. This is exactly the way it is. All I've added is just this if condition here, and most of this is simply text. And I'm just basically using this parent ref, entity ref, child entity ref, and the quoted name as the variables that are going to return parent, child, and the relationship name down here below. So those are a few samples here. There are many other ways that you can actually use the software as well. For example, you may, one example of where I've used this in the past is we've added the ability to have calculated columns within Oracle columns, which is supported in the next release, but not currently, but you can do that by creating a UDP with that value in it. Like I mentioned before, you can have specific stored properties, or storage properties, I should say, like indexes, table spaces that are always being used over and over and over again. You can use that to create a value based on that value. You can, for example, have a foreign key index and constraint name, which is the same, and you can define that as a UDP and then simply use that in both places at the same time. And there's basically your imagination can run wild, and any kind of anything that you're doing recursively, and also, of course, filtering out objects. So you may, for example, find that you are seeing way too much Oracle storage property information that you don't necessarily want to see. You're seeing your collate statements in SQL Server, or your Teradata models have all these column properties that you may want to ignore. You can just filter them all out just by cutting them completely out of your FET files, and then just saving that as your standard. So that concludes the presentation. Let me just do a quick recap here before we auction off or raffle off the $100 gift card. And I don't think my voice will hold up much longer, so I made it this far. But so via the FET editor, users can customize the ERwin generated SQL. They can include properties based on conditions using UDPs, for example. You can filter out object properties, like I mentioned before. You can use available resources when building projects. Make sure to navigate ERwin.com. Make sure to use the PDF files that are included with the ERwin installation, etc. Feel free to experiment. There's no risk. You can always just reset back to your default included FET files. There's no risk at all. Use the editors there to make changes up top, see how the live changes occur down in the expanded text, and then just simply build little projects a little at a time, identify the flow of the code, and then you'll see just from trial and error, it's much simpler than you actually think it is. And this full FET editor, by the way, is only available in 7.3. The forward engineer template code did exist in 7.2, but it was a manual process using text editors, not that user-friendly. If you've not upgraded to 7.3, you really should. It has there's a new ODBC query editor, which is really powerful. There's all these new features as well, but specifically in the context of this presentation, very useful for having that development studio for the 7.3 code. So I just want to quickly, if anybody wants to contact me, you can email me at ca.erwin@programmers.com. I have a blog which covers, my very first blog topic was on one of these examples. So if you want to look at this in any more detail, it's maximumdatamodeling.blogspot.com. I'm on Twitter at maxdatamodeling, and follow me if you want to get updates on when our next webinar series, which I believe it's probably going to be end of January, beginning of February when we start out our next series. And there'll be a lot of information next year, by the way, because of R8 coming out. So you definitely want to be notified when the new webinars and blog postings, et cetera, are available. And we also have a LinkedIn group. If you go to most popular, which is just generic coding for the groups, it's 314-1647. You can have a copy of this presentation if you'd like to have access to it, or just contact me and I'll forward you links to all of this information as well. So any questions? While we wait for the questions to come in, we will do the raffle as well. So.
Okay, and for the raffle, the winner is, and this is randomly picked out of a hat, basically, and the winner is Art H. from Geico. Art, somebody will be contacting you shortly with all the information about how you're going to receive your Best Buy gift card. And yay, Art. Woo! Okay, we do have a question that just came in. Hold on one second. How do you manage customized FE templates across many desktops with new versions ERwin and when a PC is refreshed?
The best method for that is I would suggest save the FET file to a share drive. Can I share my desk? No. Hold on a second. I'm sorry, I'm just passing control back to me for a minute. What you can do is when you actually build your FET files, let me go back to my ERwin. So when I do a forward engineer here, I'm for example, sharing this to this is just to my C drive. However, I could have saved this file to a shared directory. And now what's really powerful about saving it to a shared directory is, let's say that I put that as part of a template file and I save that into my model manager, let's say. Now, even if I'm running, no matter what PC I open that model from, on another PC, if I connect to the model manager and I open a brand new model, I can now still load that file from the shared drive. So since it's loading from the shared drive, I have access to it, and it's like globally available to me, no matter what PC I log in from, or even other users. If I want to make this a standard, I can have that as standard within the software itself. Now, if you don't have the model manager, that's okay. You can still create a template file, use a file save as, and once you've attached the template file, or I should say once you've attached this FET file, you can save this as an ERwin template, and then, for example, the next time I do a file new, I would see like the template file would be available here. So I can have like my, I could have a template file here that would say custom FET. I would open that, or when I do a reverse engineer or create a new model, I would select that as my template file instead. It will be pointing at this shared drive. And so once again, I don't have to port the file over. I have the ability of just opening that file from anywhere, and it's connecting to the shared drive. So I'm loading the latest version of the FET.
Okay, we'll wait for another question or two to be coming in. In the meantime, for more information, if questions do arise after the presentation, you can contact Victor at CA or anyone in our CA team at ca.erwin@programmers.com. For software services, product upgrades, process engagement, CA ERwin training, you could also contact us through the email address or call us at 800-221-7110 and visit us on the web at www.programmers.com/CA for past webinars, the recording of this webinar also. And there is also Victor's blog again. Thank you everyone for attending. And actually we do have one question coming in right now. How does the rework to get the colors? Victor?
What was the question?
From Jack. How does the rework to get the colors?
Oh, how did I get? Oh, yeah. Oh, you mean when I did the reverse engineer? The way that worked was oh, hang on a second. Let me take control here. I'm going through here without sharing my desktop. I did that once again using templates, by the way. So when I did the reverse engineer, the template file that I used from my model manager, the one that had the custom UDP collation, I'll show you very quickly. We'll do another reverse engineer here. If you go to my model properties, I'm sorry, not model properties, my format, default fonts and colors. So I've defined these within my default fonts and colors. So for example, my foreign keys are migrating as red. My tables have this different fill color, etc. So this was actually defined into a template file. So once I actually defined these defaults that I wanted, these colors, once again I did a file save as, and I saved it as a template file. And by saving it as a template file, it was reusable. So I can use it during a reverse engineer. I can use it when I build a new model. And by the way, I have a webinar on a template. So whoever asked the question, please do go to the link and check out the webinar I have on templates. But that's basically what you want to look at. You have the ability of creating stored display settings, subject areas, reusable drawing objects, icons that you have to specify for groups and stuff like that, domains that you might want to define and use them over and over again. Anyway, I cover this all in much more detail on that other webinar, but that's what you want to do. So you want to have your colored behavior, your text boxes, anything like that. Save it into a template file, and then when you do a new reverse engineer, all that stuff will come automatically.
Okay. With that, don't see any other questions coming in. Just FYI, somebody will be contacting all the attendees today with information regarding how we're going to get the iTunes gift card out to you, getting information from you where we'd like to either mail them or how you'd like to receive that. So someone will be in contact with you shortly from our CA ERwin team. Again, thank you very much for attending today's webinar, and if you would like to hear this webinar, it can be viewed on the web or give us a call. And if there are any other questions, please feel free to contact us. Thank you again, and have a good day.